Hello, everyone. Okay, now we are at 2, and we have an amazing speaker today, Emily Tseng. She's a postdoctoral researcher at Microsoft Research and an upcoming assistant professor at the University of Washington. And she has worked a lot in the context of internet partner violence and health and well-being. And the floor is yours, Emily.
Yeah. Thanks, Shreya. Folks in the back, can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. I'll try to stay about this level, but give me a shout if it gets too quiet. Appreciate the invitation. I'm really happy to meet you all. I actually think I don't know most of you, which is really exciting for me these days. So I'm excited for the chance to speak to everyone. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss some of my work bringing feminist methods, topics, and orientations to the space of digital safety. And that means I'm going to be talking about some potentially difficult things in partner violence, domestic violence, stalking, and how that's enacted and made worse through digital technologies. So I just like to give a warning, you don't have to listen to this if it's not what you want to think about right now. Feel free to walk away, disengage, whatever you would like. So first, who am I? That's me in a jacket that I should have brought to Stockholm. I'm at Microsoft Research currently, and I finished my PhD last May at Portal Information Science. Before coming back to academia, I spent several years in the US tech industry, startups, big tech companies, working as a designer, engineer, so on and so forth. Before that, I got my bachelor's at Princeton, did math and science, mostly ran my college newspaper. And next spring, I'll start as professor at UW in HCD. So that's the CV version. The more personal version, I'm an eldest daughter of an engineer and a lab scientist who came to the US from Taiwan. And I spent my formative years in Singapore and then in Nashville, Tennessee in the American South. There I went to an all-girls high school before I left for college. And it's that experience and being on academic scholarships in a lot of those spaces that gave me commitments to a practical form of feminism. I think that gender is best discussed in direct conversation with things like race, class, migration, and culture. And I think that today living a feminist life is about solidarity with many of those movements and using your relative privilege to improve conditions for everyone. And so far in my career, I've channeled that drive and experience and motivation into a research program that aims to map and mitigate technology's role in harm across multiple levels of society. On the interpersonal level, I spent a lot of my PhD working on technology's role in gender-based violence, how abusers use the basic affordances of phones and apps to surveil and stalk their victims. I did a lot of foundational work with survivors and in online communities to understand how tech is abused in GBV. And then I also mounted direct interventions, working directly with survivors to help them protect themselves. And I'll talk more about those a little bit. I've also worked at the level of organizations on how technology concretizes worker exploitation, looking particularly at frontline care work as a site for this. And finally, in research, I've been looking at harms arising from data-centric methods, new problems in privacy, agency, and trauma for research subjects. And I'll talk quite a bit about that today. Now, working across these levels, I'm part of this new research community. We call ourselves Digital Safety. It's at the intersection of HCI and computer security and privacy, or SMP. And what motivates our community is computing technology's role in these urgent societal inequities. And new technologies, there are moments where they can actually help to address these inequities, but technology is always changing, always introducing new vulnerabilities and exploits that instead amplify inequity and harm. These issues combine into some core sociotechnical questions that, to me, are also engineering challenges. What makes different people feel safer or more vulnerable in their technology experience? And how can we build systems that help different people and different communities define what safety, security, and privacy might mean for them? Here, I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of obligation to build new kinds of tech by thinking of the technological and social together as one. So in digital safety, we're interdisciplinary by training and an aspiration. We're trained to think about problems in this sort of feedback loop. You investigate harms and then build interventions to support harm survivors. And in both that foundational research and our interventions, they can be at whichever level of impact you want to have, micro in day-to-day individual experiences of harm, meso in organizational context for harm, and macro at the level of policy and social forces. And my observation for us today is that no matter the level, this is really hard. To be clear, we need this understand, mitigate loop. We need to be doing interventions. We need this process of investigating grievous harms and building interventions to improve conditions for people suffering at any level. But this is taxing, as we've all discussed today, for researchers and research participants alike. How do we design safer technologies when doing so requires designers and engineers to engage with some of humanity's worst experiences? So today, I'll share research that I've done to probe this question through two papers, through the case study of tech-facilitated IPV. First, work on how to safely engage survivors through participatory data stewardship. This was published at CSCW back in November. Then I'll share more about how to safely engage researchers. This is coming up at CSW this coming October, actually. And if I have time, I'll use this to motivate some ongoing and upcoming research on AI red teaming, what I've been up to at Microsoft. So that's my plan for today. I'm hoping this can be like fairly interactive because it's the afternoon. So please ask questions. I'll keep an eye out for raised hands. There'll also be sort of a pause with some questions at the end of each paper session. Good. Thank you, guys. All right, let's jump in. So first, necessary background. Intimate partner violence, or IPV, is an umbrella term for many forms of violence, including physical and emotional abuse, stalking, and harassment that's enacted against someone by a current or former intimate partner. IPV is widespread, particularly among women and in the trans community. And at its core, IPV is about power and control. Monitoring a partner's movements and who they talk to, putting them down, coercing them to sex, and isolating them from family and friends. We know from studies with survivors that today, much of this abuse is enacted through digital technologies. Survivors who report their abusers seem to have these powers, like knowing their location at all times, turning their Wi-Fi or their heating and cooling on and off, constant harassment, and as we've discussed a lot at this workshop, image-based sexual abuse, and posting intimate photos all over the internet, and even adjusting them using AI. So the key question becomes, how do we keep up? How do we learn about new and emerging abuses of technology before they become this widespread? One way to do this might be to look to what's called clinical computer security. This is an approach where trained technologists meet directly with survivors of abuse one-on-one to investigate and advise on their security and privacy needs. This is the advocate scientist model that we talk about in my PhD lab, which mimics kind of a clinician researcher model like you have in medicine, MD, PhDs, who are trained in the basic science of what goes on and also clinical practices around how to help people. I won't talk too much more about this, but if you're curious, you can ask me or Rosie Bellini, who's here, and Jesus also. We're all working on some of the clinical approaches. And this approach is high touch, right? Meeting with someone one-on-one means it also produces really unique data. Survivors tell incredibly detailed stories of their abuse experiences, what tools were involved, how it happened, how it felt, what actions they tried to stop it, how their friends and family might have reacted, and so on and so forth. And these stories, they could be so valuable to research and practice in abuse mitigation. And unlike in more traditional studies with survivors, they're gathered on the ground in situ where survivors already are. But what if we were able to use these clinics as kind of a real-world monitoring system for how technology is abused in IPV? Infrastructure like this could help us learn about survivors' experiences in safer and more ethical ways. Survivors, they tell us over and over, they want these stories known. As this one told me, the more people can learn from my experience, the better. How can we hold anyone accountable if we don't know the weight of what's happening? The key is to enable them to share these stories without incurring re-traumatization. I don't want to be overwhelmed. I don't want to be interviewing with a bunch of random people telling this story over and over again. So that was the question at the center of this first study. How do we share stories of tech abuse gathered in these clinical encounters for safety research? We know that generally research can be traumatizing for survivors and for any participant cause unwanted burdens. We want to give survivors agency in how their experiences are recorded and shared, but we also never want to force someone to relive one of the worst experiences of their lives. So to find this balance, we looked at this framework called participatory data stewardship. This is a set of mechanisms for involving people in governance of how data about them is generated and used. If I'm designing a data collection system and I know I want it to be somehow participatory, how do I decide how to build it? One of our contributions in this paper is this conceptual framework to help us make these core trade-offs between researcher control and participant control. I'll walk us through this. On the x-axis, you have increasing researcher supervision and the burden that comes with it. And on the y-axis, you have increasing community supervision and the burden that comes with that. You can plot specific mechanisms and approaches to participation along these axes. Some emphasize complete researcher control with no input from the community, mechanisms like explainability in this informed bucket in the bottom right. Others emphasize complete community control, things like data cooperatives that are entirely owned and operated by participants who then also bear all the burdens of doing that work. And in between, you have this middle ground of approaches where researchers and participants split the load. And they can vary in how participatory they are. You have things like focus groups at the level of consultation, citizen juries at the level of involvement, and data trust or data donation at the level of collaboration. Okay, so now we have a framework. How do we pick a point on our plot? How do we decide what to build? The literature emphasizes doing this through deep contextual co-design with your target community to find out what works best for them. So we set out to do that deep contextual co-design with IPV survivors. We want to know first, are they even willing to do this, to share their data? And we worked with the Clinic to End Tech Abuse and recruited IPV survivors to design research. CETA is one of the original groups that has initiated and really popularized clinical computer security and provides consultation to survivors in all 5 boroughs of New York City. If you're curious about how that all works, again, myself or Rosie or Hisi can tell you more. So by partnering with CETA, we created these mock-ups of what client records at CETA look like to researchers. It should be said, this is entirely synthetic data written by me based on my experience in the field. No actual data is depicted here, and we didn't show anyone's actual data to them in the sessions either. As you can see, these records contain transcripts of the appointment in which the client shares details of their abuse experience. There's also notes from the consultant, kind of like doctor's notes, and the contents of referral forms. That's categorical data often, things like what do you suspect, radar buttons for what platforms or devices are implicated, things like that. So first, we showed these to our participants to give them a sense of what data are we talking about? What are we even looking to share? And then we set about understanding their preferences for how to share this data using these worksheets. Here's just one example. We'd give them a particular recipient, in this case, journalists and the press. And for that recipient, we'd ask them to consider different data types from the set that we just showed them. That's these blue boxes in the middle. And then we'd ask them to place it on the number line below according to how comfortable they are sharing that data type to that recipient. So we use prompts like these to ask survivors about 11 different recipients and purposes for their data, ranging from journalists to law enforcement for the purposes of raising awareness or punishing abusers. And from this exercise, we came away with a table kind of like this, giving us a bit of a sense of survivors' preferences. What's depicted here is just like one snippet. Here, darker green means that on average, they were more comfortable sharing, and the lighter the green, the less comfortable they were. So we can see from this that contrary to what a privacy-minded researcher might have expected, survivors are actually pretty willing to share their data under some circumstances. We can see from this, one caveat, we did ask survivors who by definition had consented to our research study, so there is that, but we think the variance is still kind of interesting. We see, for example, survivors are generally not comfortable sharing data to punish abusers. Again, this work was in the US context, particularly in New York City, and many said they were nervous about giving anyone over to the criminal justice system, even their abuser. They also said they weren't comfortable sharing data with the police more generally. Often survivors have had really negative encounters with law enforcement trying to seek help in the past. That's what brings them to something like a clinic. So this was, again, sort of a confirmatory result. But for recipients like academics and advocates, or purposes like building better tech products, survivors were actually pretty willing to share. Of course, not all preferences were so clear-cut. Survivors are very divided on what to share with policymakers, writ large, or with specific tech companies. We had a lot of folks say, oh, Google's stealing all my data, so I wouldn't want to share this with them, and that type of thing. So we learned from this, it turns out survivors are willing to share data under very specific circumstances. That's great. The question becomes then, how do we give them granular control of their data to express those preferences in ways that aren't burdensome? To answer this, we again did design research with survivors, and this time we looked at some prototypes. Going back to our conceptual framework, we decided that since survivors were willing to share data, we consider mechanisms under collaborate, and specifically two types, open records and dynamic consent. What do I mean by open records? This is a movement in the states to democratize access to health records. I think it's been like federal law since 2019 and hopefully still is. Our interpretation of open records for digital safety was to give people access to the tags that researchers might place on their case, things like medium tech literacy, financial abuse up there. And we also included the ability to comment on the record to provide context. So over here on the right, clarifications, like I realize now it started happening 1 year ago, or even requests for redaction. Down here, can you remove this? And our second affordance, dynamic consent. This is the idea that we should be able to give and remove consent at any point in time. And we interpreted this as a system enabling a user to see requests for their data and deny or agree to releasing specific subsets of it, perhaps even remove data from ongoing studies. So we showed these prototypes to our survivor participants and discussed how they might use them. The reactions were pretty interesting. Some survivors saw potential for narrative control through the medium of interacting with and managing their own data. The survivors said they like certain tags like trauma survivor better than tags like abused because they could be seen as a survivor instead of a victim. They also wanted to use the data to self-reflect and hold themselves accountable for their own healing journey. This survivor says they actually want to use their case records as material in psychotherapy. You can look at this with your therapist or doctor, like, why do you want to redact this? It's real, it's what you experienced. Let's talk about that. Still, participants did feel the overhead of making all of these data decisions that might be burdensome and unwanted in the end. Many said they wanted a steward, for example, a partner or researcher or a case manager, to help them make sure the data is used efficiently and for legitimate purposes. As this one says, you can collect data for years and years and years, and you just don't see the purpose. So I would like someone with integrity to help, so I know we're not just wasting our time. So what do we conclude from all of this? We think there are substantial potential benefits to participatory data approaches in digital safety. Survivors can improve their own sense of agency. They get back some of that power and control by reflecting on and managing their own data. There are also benefits to broader research and to support services. In response to this work, we updated some consent processes at CETA. This is exciting. I think for our broader research community, it also points to some directions at the intersection of participatory methods and digital safety. First, we might consider that in digital safety cases, individual interests may at times be stronger than collective ones. And that runs contrary to literature in participation, where community decision-making is often seen as the best way to shift power to data subjects en masse. In digital safety, the notion of community is kind of tough to reason about. How do you design community governance for a group of people whose only commonality is having experienced the same type of harm? As we saw, survivors' preferences vary, and there can also be situations where they need to break from the collective for their own safety. We also saw some paths for technical innovation here, ways to query and analyze data under changing definitions of what privacy means, ways to make granular control attractable for survivors, like rate limiting the requests they get or abstracting from their preferences whether a new request is worth entertaining. And finally, co-design in digital safety, I think, has these really unique constraints. Our work here showed that doing this contextual design research with survivors, it's really important, but it's really hard. Every session I did with survivor as a part of this study lasted more than a lot of 1 hour. I think my longest one lasted 3 hours. You have to give someone the emotional space to tell their story before you ask them to look at your prototype. So I think developing methods to do this sustainably for both survivors and researchers, that's an area that we could all be looking toward. Overall, though, I think this direction is really exciting, merging participatory approaches with what we think about in digital safety. Okay, that was study one. I have a set of questions here. We'd be happy to sort of open up the floor. What are folks' impressions, thoughts? Would love to hear how this resonates with work or themes that you all have been seeing.
Can you go back to the heat map?
Yeah. This is like my #1 question. Like this, go back to the heat map, which we can linger on anybody.
Is it borrowed from the paper? Because I will go and read the paper. So I see that you have both the recipients and the conditions together.
Yes.
Did you, I'll read the paper later, but I wanted to ask did you find any intersectionality between like conditions and recipients?
Yeah, great question. Let me go back to, yes. So we split up recipients and purposes. I am blanking right now on which literature we pulled this from, but the idea is that there can be combinations, right, between these permutations. We did not do that permuting because that would have been simply too many conditions to ask one about in this phase of the study. But I think it would be really interesting, a great next study might be to look at, for example, two squares that happen to be close to each other and see, right? Instinctively, I would say I'm most curious about the sort of in-between ones and linking those to purposes to see if that gives you anything more. In the paper, I know we also, in some of the follow-ups where we ask them about the results, you can sort of implicitly see a link. So tech companies, for instance, right? Like if Google is trying to do the research for marketing purposes, no one wants to share the data for that. But if it's actually to help with like a broader legislative effort, maybe. So.
Yeah, because for example, if you give them the option, oh, if I can give informed consent and I can revoke it later, they might be happy to share it with tech companies, right?
Okay, so modality would be sort of the addition. Yeah, I think the question of like how to operationalize informed consent is another way to just describe this entire study, right? So we were curious to separate intention from mechanism first, but that's a great point. I think leading with mechanism might affect how folks think about it.
They're reading your messages now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah. Was that a question online?
Yeah, there's one question from Harsha. Harsha, you can unmute and ask the question.
Right. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting presentation. I just had two questions. One was with this type of data, I think when you are doing the interviews, I see that you ask for consent, but is in the future, if this becomes an algorithmic system, similar to like saying, okay, can somebody ask a bot or an agent to sort of say, okay, automatically ask for consent to a person, compared to general health data, this type of data might require a human being instead to sort of create that safety aspect. Could you comment on that? And the second part was, are there current legal frameworks in the US similar to GDPR here to sort of have some sort of safeguards for privacy? I could also flip that and ask, what is the incentive for me to share this with a tech company? Because tech companies, it's my personal opinion that they don't have much trust nowadays. So thank you.
Yeah, great questions. For the latter point, no, we don't have something like GDPR in the States. I think state by state, there's privacy legislation that might cover some of this, but those are, to my knowledge, pretty localized to consumer sort of digital trace style data. This was data in a clinical context. That is also, the other question I get in US context is like, isn't this health information? And shouldn't this be regulated under the very elaborate set of regulations we have for that? The answer is no. Clinical is not medical data in this context. So it falls into a bit of a donut hole between those two regimes in the States at the moment. And then to your question on incentives, that was kind of the goal of the study, was to look at, independent of regulation, what survivors' incentives might be and their motivations to share information with anyone who could help. I think for tech companies in particular, the subset of folks who did answer affirmatively probably have a more optimistic vision of what tech companies would do with the information, but that's for follow-up studies. And so your first question was about, agents. Yeah, I personally don't know of efforts to try and get informed consent from survivors using chatbots, although I can imagine they probably do exist. We didn't do this study assuming or projecting any type of AI system would be on the horizon. That wasn't the goal of it, so I can't comment on that. I do think a lot of our results do point to a human touch being pretty important. None of the stewards that people mentioned as potential brokers for their data were automated. So we'll see. But the world changes all the time, so who knows?
Thank you.
Yeah. I loved your point about keeping co-production sustainable. I'm curious, my team talks a lot about this in the context of we want to promote as much engagement with the things we're designing as possible, and therefore promote what we're doing, but balance that with the realities of how much power we have as researchers and much bigger constraints. I'm sure in the States you feel this a lot more heavily. I'm curious how you sort of have been navigating that with these folks. Like, have you encountered any tensions between, because sometimes our participants feel really strongly that what we're creating should reach the public as soon as possible, right? Or that we do as much impact as possible. And that's not always possible with resources or just the current kind of structure of data. I'm curious if you've come across that at all, and whether that sort of factors into some of the kind of ethical conversations you're having around this, and how we can kind of do that sustainably and transparent.
Yeah, great, complicated question.
Sorry.
No, it's great, it's great. What are we here for if not to, right? Yeah, let me jump back to, where is it? Okay, I'm gonna be honest, this result for academics actually surprised me. I thought that people might be a little more skeptical of what we do and our ability to sort of have impact or make change. A lot of people, I think, do have that, I don't wanna be like too cynical about it. A lot of people in this study did have a very optimistic vision of what the study could do, which is great, right? I think for, so a couple of points. I think we have a bit more power over how we navigate the researcher participant dynamic for these situations, for digital safety research, right? And I sort of draw that boundary around it because I think in general research there's lots of problems, but in this in particular, there's a reason to study harms that are caused by consumer tech companies and then report your results to consumer tech companies. Like there's a very clear sort of intended impact story there, right? So I think a lot of the pitch in sort of the consent conversations before they would jump in would be like, yeah, we have worked with, for example, Google, Facebook, Microsoft in the past to like report vulnerabilities or talk about potential changes. And that's a reason to do this study. Fantastic. And as far as impact-focused scholarship constitutes sort of corridors of power, fine, right? Like right now they happen to be these tech companies. In the past, it's been different ones. And there's a lot of legislation happening right now where policymakers might be another sort of, great. A lot of the implicit goal in the study is like, what if we just reported this stuff directly to the people in power and just didn't go through academics at all? And I think trying to carefully negotiate the burden question was our way around that. So part of the issue with conceptualizing, here we go. Part of the issue with conceptualizing this way, a lot of people get kind of mad at this, at the explainability and informed being kind of just interventionist. Because some people just want to be informed and then not worry about it, right? But I think the goal is to say, okay, if you did want more control, there is a spectrum of ways that a survivor could try and sort of make their stories known. If you wanted less, we're there to help you, right? But I don't know, and I think this picture, per your point, is changing a whole lot with where academia sits in the States and otherwise. Anything else? Yeah.
I'm curious. You made your point about like MD, PhDs having like clinical preparation and all that kind of stuff. And I'm wondering what kind of preparation you and your colleagues go through to be able to appropriately respond, compartmentalize, deal with such a very emotional and very sensitive topic.
Yeah, great question. We'll talk a lot about researcher well-being in the next part, but for the actual clinical work, which is not in the next part of the talk, it's a huge challenge. And I think moving from being a student who was trained in this to being a professor, I think it's a really material question. Like if I try and run a team that does this, right? So a lot of support structures include things like tons of debriefs and just a lot of like, you set up your 1 hour appointment, but then you reserve half an hour in your calendar before and after to make sure that everyone on the call is like ready for the study, that type of thing. I mentioned the 3 hour thing with some participants, and our time is productivity and money, right? So I think for the emotional piece, we took a lot of cues from trauma-informed care, which I'll detail a little bit more about later. That's one way that we thought about everything from like aesthetic details of what the room should look like. So things like we have a much more sterile space at Cornell Tech than the room that we're in right now. So things like, okay, I'll bring like a blanket from home and just make the space look warm, like lighting, details like that, all the way out to like being careful with language. Really early on, this is probably my like second year of the PhD. I had a client who I think everyone in the room, myself included, just misgendered for like half the appointment, and we didn't figure it out. They didn't say anything until sort of halfway through, and oh, okay, my bad, right? Like things like that we don't really get training for on the research side. So in my opinion, obviously biased, like it's worth it. I think it draws you a lot closer to survivor's experience, makes the research richer and more interesting. But I would hesitate to sort of broadly recommend to anyone who's thinking about a long-term career, like definitely do it. I don't know, guys, like it's pretty hard. There is, or was for a while, a decent amount of funding in the States to do clinical work like this, all under like the Violence Against Women Act. So we'll see. But I think these approaches are more and more recognized as valuable, both in sort of the technical community that a lot of this research speaks to. And then also I've been talking to a lot of social workers and social work scholars, and they all still are craving some sort of help with the tech component of this too. So multiple avenues through which you can get that type of training to map this type of thing. Thanks for the question. Okay, I saw one hand over here, if that's still viable.
That was me.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's all good.
I guess it's more of a thought that I don't know if it's going to turn into a question. But I really like that there was a temporal aspect as well, and it's a situational aspect to sort of the follow-up study, or it was the same study, but follow-up it with the design work, I believe.
Oh, that was indeed all one study. Yeah.
Okay. And I was just thinking about in the context of when we do work with people and collect this rich interview data that, like, you know, we receive consent for a very specific study, but there's perhaps future research that can be done with it, but it's a different context and it's a different set of researchers. And I just wonder if this, I think I'm just throwing it out to the group here, if this is something that we should consider in like future interviews or like future ways of working with data from the participants that we are engaging in our research, like the ability to consistently go back and say, I consent to this or not. But yeah. Has this come up in your subsequent
yeah,
work?
I would be happy to has anyone encountered there's like qualitative research, like secondary archives for qualitative research now? I think I think that stuff's kind of cool. No, it's very very contested. A lot of folks on the social science, on like traditional social science side are like, no, it's contextual. It emerged from a single encounter. You can never reinterpret it, right? But like, so active academic debate. I just think those efforts are kind of cool, like just from like an infrastructure perspective. So we'll be really, really happy to talk more about that. I don't know if anyone here happens to have a lot of experience with those. I think those are interesting. Cool. Yeah. All right. I'm going to keep going. Cool. So that was number one. All right. If we bump back up a level, we just talked a lot about engaging with survivors. The other side of the research exchange is the researcher, right? So here's my take on sort of the researcher well-being discussion. Concerns around this are not new, but because harms in digital safety are becoming so severe and so widespread, I think for those of us who intentionally prioritize feminist and alternative ways of knowing, we know it can take this really special toll. It's a very particular type of connection, hearing the worst thing that someone's ever experienced, emphasizing with them through it, and then exposing yourself to so many of those stories in aggregate, they're able to do things like understand, abstract, generalize, derive internal logics, devise solutions. And I saw this over and over in the PhD work, not only in traditional settings for exposure and empathy, like in clinic or in one-on-one interviews, but especially in those empirical forms of new media research, things like social media data, or even larger scale clinical records. It's one thing to interview 10 people and sort of sit with them for multiple hours each time and really understand sort of what their lives are like. It's another thing to dive into this massive data set where you don't really have map or territory. What I'll posit to you is that this type of engagement with harm, it's not only a concern for my own mental health and my team's mental health and researcher well-being as a whole, it's also material to the research that we're all producing. If we take seriously that a researcher's standpoint is essential to the sense-making that produces new insights, then the traumas that might accumulate for researchers start to affect analysis. And this isn't a judgment call. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I just think it's something that we have to account for. So what can we do? One way to try and account for this might be to look to the framework of trauma-informed computing and actually try and rebuild our research infrastructures in trauma-informed ways. So trauma-informed computing, or TIC, this is an approach to technology that draws on those practices in the clinical work that Adrian set up for me just now. And myself and some collaborators led by New Chen wrote a paper on this back at CHI in 2022. lots of folks have been working with this concept. Carol Scott did one on trauma-informed approach to social media. Casey Rendaz has been doing great work sort of adapting it for grief journeys and stuff like that. So really, it's a really exciting area of research that I'd be happy to talk more about. But for our purposes, what is trauma? And what does it mean to be trauma-informed? Well, trauma is defined in the literature as any type of stressful reaction and then long-lasting adverse impact to at least one to a what's called like a traumatic event. And estimates are that this actually affects billions of people. Estimated 70% of people experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetime, whether that's war or disaster, abuse or violence, illness or grief. We describe TIC as sort of the intentional acknowledgement that this happens can affect technology experience, and not just acknowledgement of that, but the work to actively mitigate these effects. It's important to note that not everyone who experiences a traumatic event is traumatized. Not everyone who experiences a death in the family has the same experience with grief, right? It's a sort of similar concept. Not everyone reacts to distressing events in the same way. And trauma also doesn't always need to have a formal or medicalized diagnosis, so things like PTSD. But research does show that 70% of the world is billions of people, so it's a fairly prevalent effect to attend to. And across this field, we all tend to draw on the same set of 6 principles from trauma-informed care. This was our reinterpretation of them in the Chen et al. 2022 paper. The principles are safety, so emphasizing that overall, trust and transparency with the system, enablement. So this is drawing on a lot of feminist HI literature. This used to be empowerment. This is the acknowledgement that asking people to be empowered in the face of systems is maybe not realistic, and instead we should be thinking about enablement. Peer support so peer support is at the peer level, and collaboration is a bit more with sort of the powers that create the technology that you work with. And then intersectionality, which in the literature is big bucket, gender, culture, historical issues. We call it intersectionality for reasons that we describe in the paper. I want to stress again that we think these principles are relevant to all stages of technology, not just in technical decision-making at the design level, but also maintenance, support, those layers of infrastructure that really define technology experience in the immediate and longer term. And in our paper, we detail how to apply these at all sorts of different levels, including organizational culture. So, if we're armed with these 6 principles, we sought in this study to build research tools in trauma-informed ways. And our key insight was this. Many of these principles could be enacted through modern machine learning technologies. Things like personalization, prediction, and semantic search. You could say that you could use those to reimagine how qualitative coding could be a collaborative and trauma-informed practice. This is the hypothesis. So we did this by applying a design research inquiry process to put TIC into practice. And this follows a pretty standard design loop. First, you identify the problem, sort of elaborate it. We sort of did a landscape analysis, lots of coding tools out there. We didn't really find anything that specifically accounted for the content that you were looking at, a lot more stuff that was focused on just making you faster. There was this notion of content warnings, so labels that you might place on potentially horrifying content. The literature is pretty divided on whether content warnings are actually helpful, but we'll come back to that. Whether or not they're helpful, they're pretty hard to operationalize. So a lot of the machine learning literature looks into how existing classification approaches have this global sense of what's toxic, negative, or harmful, which I think we would all in this room agree is a little bit not quite what we need. So from this distillation, we mapped out these 2 design goals or objectives. We wanted to personalize what an analyst looking at a transcript might consider to be traumatic, and that we can say follows the TIC principles of enablement and intersectionality. And second, we want to support what we call self-management of traumatic exposure. This is pursuant to enablement, safety, and collaboration, the ability to sort of control your own experience with that reaction. We took those 2 design goals, worked up a bunch of features, and then built and tested a prototype. I had thought to maybe play the video, but I am going to spare you a live demo and instead this is kind of how it works. You build personalized models of what a certain label means to you by selecting some text, adding a label, and sort of refining that. You can accept or reject suggestions and continue labeling the document to just through that pretty standard machine learning process. And then the system can sort of project forward based on analyzing the rest of your document or your data set, how many more times are you likely to see that thing that you labeled as potentially traumatic? So in this case, sexual assault. The user can select the concept. Maybe she wants to seed it with labels from someone who's a trusted confidant or a trusted researcher, and get warnings for how many more times she might encounter the concept. So we built this prototype, and we put it in front of 15 digital safety researchers with instructions to use it to analyze their own data on digital safety harms. And through participants' reactions to our prototype, we sort of mapped out the design space around how to make these research tools more trauma-informed. First, our participants were pretty clear they didn't actually want machine learning for task efficiency. As this participant says, it should be slower when it's heavy. We know that generally machine assistance is more appropriate for deductive tasks, like categorically labeling large data sets. But participants stressed that even the most deductive of safety research had to retain some sort of inductive sense of creativity. We should always be reflecting on how our own conceptions of safety color our research. And a lot of participants said things like, I want to understand my own mental model. That's what I want, more than sort of a raw count of codes. Interestingly, for the more computational folks, no one was actually that concerned with how accurate the tool was. I think the actual feedback loop that was implied in the tool was pretty clear to people. So whether or not it actually produced some sort of positive evaluation was sort of beside the point. So instead of speeding up work, participants wanted machine assistance to help them understand their own traumatic exposures and reactions. As this participant says, they want, quote, concrete evidence from the software to help them self-reflect. This was seen as a more appropriate use of machine measurement, counting, things that these are built to do, and noticing and helping a researcher come to better knowledge of themselves. But what about managing a reaction once the machine has noticed it? Our participants didn't really like the idea of the tool taking an active role, like parental control or screen time, but for your research. And most of this is pretty expected, right? We have this natural inclination toward human agency versus machine, but the notion's pretty complex when it comes to researcher well-being. I like this quote because it points out there's this tendency to valorize exposure and how much you can handle in research, right? Several pointed out that this effect can be particularly worse for researchers at more junior levels of their careers. As this one says, there's a tendency to say, I can handle it, it's fine. And the tool might suggest that I take more breaks than I would consciously impose on myself. In addition, this is several years past the era of computing for behavior change being deeply in vogue. And a lot of people, we had some affordances for nudges and stuff like that. A lot of people said, oh, I don't want that. I would just X out right away. And finally, participants saw a role for the tool in collaborative practice. This is a set of findings that I think is really, really interesting. A lot of analysts, we didn't lay out sort of a collaborative case, but a lot of people jumped straight to it in their reaction to the tool, sort of saying, cool, I could use this when I, divide a set of transcripts between my entire research team. And maybe the researchers who have more experience with one concept get more time with this, so on and so forth. And doing this, optimistically could help us either protect people with stronger sensitivities to certain concepts than others. It could also be a way to sort of move concepts between researchers and get some sort of distribution or spread. But the more junior researchers in the pool were pretty clear to point out that this could be a privacy risk too. As this one said, I'm concerned about someone building a profile on my ability to handle trauma. As a supervisor, do we want to know that information? Maybe not, but the role of a machine in sort of doing that distribution is something that just been true. So from all of this, we distilled a set of roles for machine assistance in this process. The net from this is there's a lot of contradictions here. You want the tool to be a self-reflective surface and not an enforcer. You want to help initiate fair and protective teamwork, but only with accountability to an actual human supervisor. And we think the set of contradictions points to these broader lessons in trauma-informed computing and safety design more broadly. At the core, there's this basic confusion around what safety means. When we were trying to apply these 6 principles in that design research process, this table in the paper talks more about how safety, defined as exposure reduction, just collides with the other principles all the time. Are you really enabling someone if you take away their ability to see content that could hurt them, so on and so forth, that type of thing? So we argue instead and show in the paper that reframing safety as enablement helps to resolve some of those tensions. So like I said, this will be at CSCW in the fall, and a lot of participants have actually, maybe because it's paper writing season, have been asking for updates on how the tool is working and whether I can update it for LLMs. So we'll see. The nice thing about the LLMs thing, though, like I think it's pretty clear how they could be applied and also serve as a place to really interrogate problems like agency and privacy, so potentially a generative space for research. There's also a bunch of more specific research questions. So I mentioned sort of allocating workloads between workers. That could be an interesting place to look. There's a question about how you validate these models without incurring further traumatic exposure. Is this scary? Do you want to keep looking at it? Tell me if it's scary, that type of thing. And then also more broadly, I think this idea of balancing paternalism with protection is something that digital safety research could really, really stand to grapple with. And this is a great place to look at it. All right, so that was that paper. Same deal. What are your thoughts? I'm curious to know, especially for this audience, does safety as enablement resonate with your own projects, your own contexts? Are there contexts where you see a system would be helpful or vehemently not? Both reactions are perfectly okay. And this was a very intentional, can we apply trauma-informed computing to software design and have it produce a result? So that's sort of like meta research angle I'm curious.
Just quickly to number two, absolutely. So I've done some work on this topic as well, and this was actually exactly one of the things we were debating about the use of the term safety and how it doesn't quite capture it. And I just love the way that you referred to that. I can't wait to read the paper as well. But yeah, the enablement part of this is exactly, I think, getting to the crux of the issue, that a lot of times it isn't necessarily just this perception of what we would classically think of as safe, but it's sort of like thinking about how to think about what is actionable, where the agency is, and what you can actually do in response. Right? And even if you can't do something, helping people to sort of think about, well, even if you can't act on it, what are some lessons or things that you can learn from that process that are still empowering for yourself for thinking about the future?
Totally.
Yeah. Big fan.
There's one question in the Zoom room from Harsha again.
Cool.
You want to ask your question?
Sure. I mean, I had just, again, sorry, two questions. One is like, can you give an example of how TIC would be different from, let's say, using a more traditional gender-sensitive intersectional approach to software engineering? I mean, I just want, I'm sorry to split hairs, but I'm just trying to figure out how that changes. And again, the last one is like, are you aware of any work that actually modifies LLMs because they're language based to sort of identify like patriarchal or sort of trauma inducing language while they're learning? Because I just saw you were also talking about labeling it in a better way, which is not there yet. So
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, for sure. For your first question, it's not splitting hairs. It's a very legitimate critique of trauma-informed computing as a framework. And I think it'd be really interesting to sort of dig a bit more into that. I think like the history of where trauma-informed care comes from and its interaction with the other frameworks you mentioned could be a place to start looking. So great question. I don't know. It could be cool to do a project on that. To your latter question, I think I'm not personally aware of stuff that looks at LLMs with respect to patriarchal tone in particular, but I think that could be kind of cool. Yeah, that's all I can think of. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
For me, so first of all, thank you. Amazing. I really love it. I'm really interested in sort of the double sides of some words and concepts like trauma. I was thinking a lot about trauma and how it's handled in different cultures and how it's recognized in different cultures. But in regards to your question, safety, from the work on abortion, I've had a lot of contradictions, right? So safety, the normative part of safety, and then the more like, we want safety for people to, of course, have treatment and access to health, like just an example. But I have found this huge contradiction between following the rules that are imposed, and that's more the normative part, right? And so I'm curious, it's very, very open-ended. I'm not sure if there's an answer, but I'm really curious as to how we can find a middle ground, because I was so interested in what in your contradictions, how you showed, and how that just translates in computing, because that's when it becomes sort of like more objective, right? Like we can talk about it forever. But then when we have to make decisions, then it just comes out in certain forms. So
Yeah. I like the abortion case as a clear case where a normative definition of safety that just follows the rules clearly falls apart, right? One meta comment, I actually don't really know how to talk about this paper and this line of research in the context of things like my research statements for US academia right now. I don't know sort of what's the best, right? The paper itself kind of toes that line quite a bit, like trying to appeal to multiple audiences for which exposure reduction means a different thing. So I think I like your point on how computing sort of forces actual decisions. I think this is a place where we were talking a bit about the difference in mechanisms and intentions earlier. Like separating mechanisms that have been developed from intentions is going to be something that we all have to really, really grapple with in the future. So yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. Cool. I have like 5 minutes on the AI projects. If you guys want to hear that. Yeah? Okay, great. Not sick of it yet. So, all right. Cool. So I mentioned I'm at Microsoft Research right now. And a lot of what I've been working on is trying to understand what they mean by AI red teaming. And by they, I don't mean just Microsoft, like the industry in general, right? I should say there are hopefully there's not that many slides. There's hopefully not that many trade secrets. So that there's nothing I'm saying is actually representative of the company I work for. So if you've been following updates in AI over the last few years, there's this really interesting movement. I think the computational folks have been really excited by like data-centric machine learning, as they call it. The idea that there's a lot of recognition of the human apparatus behind these models, right? Data workers was sort of a big push a little while ago. Now we have this thing called red teaming. A lot of people who were employed at these companies as security engineers or safety engineers. So, yes, the data workers in other parts of the world, but then also people who are employed at Redmond and work in SF and do this type of thing, are also sort of tasked with sitting there in front of a model and just making it say a lot of awful stuff. So yes, what safety varies here, what safety means here varies quite widely. I have actually found in the last year, it's not really a lot of the existential risk stuff that it meant maybe like a year ago. And now people are deeply focused on things like, does it produce unlawful content? Like, can it regurgitate all of the Harry Potter books? Or emotional dependence is a huge thing that folks at companies are worried about. So can it convince someone to that it's their girlfriend, things like that. And things like NCI generation are absolutely top of mind for a lot of the companies. Not just Microsoft for like liability reasons, but again, like Anthropic, Cohere, and all the players. So the basic premise, red teamers are, again, sort of staff security engineers. They're handed a model that's about to be released, and then they're asked to basically just act as if they're either sort of a user in crisis for whom it could have sort of a pretty bad effect. So a very common one is like, pretend that you're a teen in crisis. Just pretend and just see what you can get the model to do. How does it respond? Do we like its response? The other mode that they're asked to put on is more traditional adversarial testing. So for things like, can you get it to tell you exactly how to make a bomb, that type of thing. So again, people employ these companies to just sort of put on both of those hats and just try and see what happens. They're rewarded, in fact, for the creativity of the jailbreaks. So I've been part of a couple of initiatives. One is looking at this from a well-being perspective. You can imagine if my job is to sit there and pretend that I'm a teen in crisis every day for this sort of operating at the speed of how these models are released, that can get kind of difficult. And as we were saying, that's going to impact the actual safety result that comes out of the whole testing, right? So that's one thing that we're looking at. And then I would charge for us here today that, a lot of us, I think, have a lot to say about AI as a bit of a hype bubble. But these tools, machine learning, as we used to call them, are just more and more applied in areas that touch a lot of the communities that we're concerned about. So even things like moderating content, or even things like setting content policy, activities that we used to say, that should definitely be handled purely by a human, automation is creeping in more and more. And so I think like this is a potential leverage for getting back, a potential point of leverage for getting back some of that human touch, if we can manage the way the red teaming works. And I'd be happy to answer questions about what I'm seeing. I don't have prompting questions for this one, but I'd be curious if anyone has any thoughts. Yeah.
Great. And this, you guys went to CHI, it sounds like, so maybe this is already But the red teaming being done by research groups to dive into how certain misinformation can be shared and reproduce certain like qualitative interview content in AI in order to red team and then assess.
Yeah. Yeah. What's crazy from sort of like a meso perspective, this is fine. There's a funny tension where if you're a red teamer employed at a large tech company, you can't really use your own tech company's models to do things like sort of scale up the red teaming because there's safety filters on them. So you can't actually ask the scary thing that will make the scary thing appear because there's safety filters on your generation. So I was hearing a lot of them just use open source models or DeepSeek and just like take it and just use that to sort of scale up. So I think there's a lot of crossover in how the prompts are being generated. And the role of like an independent research community in doing that is, I think, actually pretty important because there's a lot of organizational limitations. A lot of what we're seeing is also the priorities for what creative energy is directed toward are pretty much largely set by like what you see in the news. So it's kind of like PR works in a lot of companies, right? Like big scary story about say like character.ai or things like that, the eating disorder story, stuff like that happens in the news. The next day, everyone on the red team is tasked with focused on that, right? So I think there is a role for independent research, both from a rigor perspective and just like what you can focus on in this practice right now.
I don't know much about red teaming. This is new to me for hearing this for the first time. I know that there are sort of these training or filters going on, but how do we ensure diversity and intersectionality is represented in the red teaming team and the sort of tests that we run through?
Great question. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say there's a lot of stated attention to it still. And I think like actually generously, like a lot of the folks who have chosen to pin their careers to this practice at these companies right now are the ones who are pretty attentive to making sure teams are diverse and servicing new harms. I just don't know, you mentioned sort of in a rigorous or systematic way, there's not really standards in the field right now, which is part of why I think makes it a great moment for research. Partly because I think a lot of the companies guard exactly what they do as trade secret, but also because there's not really incentive in sort of the ecosystem. Who's going to lead this? Like OpenAI? Like no one's actually doing the standard setting that we need to sort of make this happen, right?
Yeah, because I would imagine like where you said, imagine yourself to be a teenager.
Yeah.
That experience is going to vary so significantly here versus someone in Myanmar.
Totally.
And that output will also be very different.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. No, it's a great point. It's I've been also surprised that like we will talk a lot about problems like this, right? And we can see as academics, there's so many problems to observe. And then the reality of it day to day is just like, they are simply too busy to actually, right? Like the shortfall, I think is pretty dramatic.
Thanks.
All right, Rezi?
Yeah, so this is a question. So I know that red teams kind of exist across all areas of companies, and you've alluded to safety engineers being involved as well. But I guess my question is, where do red teams actually sit when it comes to the company hierarchy? Because I'm sure that when they actually get tasked with generating some content, some of that content actually might be illegal. So okay, most egregious example is if I try and get it to generate child sex abuse material, as soon as that material comes onto kind of my work laptop, for example, I have to go through company processes because it's illegal to obviously even have this material. And I guess my question is are these red teams supported at an institutional level, or are they expected to incur all of the burdens of like the legal challenge and kind of all of like the we're talking about re-traumatization, or are they just another class of workers which are almost like data labelers if they're not supported very well within this environment?
Yeah, great, prescient question. A lot of people are concerned that the very last thing you mentioned is going to happen, right? Okay. Like it's actually a good thing, hypothetically, if like someone who has like the salary and benefits of a full-time Microsoft employee is the person who like has to do this, right? Like that signals something about investment. But a lot of where it's headed, the concern is that it's going to get outsourced, right? At the same time, there is actual benefit to outsourcing. To your earlier point on intersectionality, right? Like there's a lot of benefit to having a wider scope of harm sort of in focus. But with respect to organizational structure, it's a little messy. I think partially because, it's all pegged to product releases, right? So one area of the company like produces, say, the foundation model. The other area is responsible for the actual agent or sort of in-between system. And then another part of the company is tasked with a specific product. So like one team cares about like how stuff shows up in like Microsoft Word. Another team cares about the actual model itself. And that also just lends to a lot of confusion. If anyone's interested in sort of like a more infrastructural or org studies perspective on it, it's actually really interesting sort of where people think harm comes from and who's tasked with being responsible for it. And then problems like which perspectives are represented are really, really, really apparent. There's also a whole twist with like consumer versus enterprise that's been interesting. I think the consumer push actually has had like a perverse effect where it actually makes attention to this really, really important for a company with consumer aspirations. So that's been kind of fun to witness. Cool. All right, Sarah?
Yeah, I just wanted to hear your perspective on some arguments for and investments in fully automated approaches to red teaming.
Yeah.
Arguments around it really kind of emphasize the safety concerns, harm reduction, risk mitigation, so on and so forth on the risk exposure to red teamers. So your thoughts?
Yeah, no, great question. I think the short answer is I think that that's a completely valid point and requires us to just simply redefine what we think red teaming is. So a lot of what they talk about is there's kind of, you can imagine sort of a distribution of harms that occur in the real world among their users. I'm doing this because no one actually does the studies to understand what that distribution looks like because they don't want to know, right? But so if you can imagine sort of distribution, there's going to be a lot of harms that are kind of in the middle. Things that you can expect, things like the emotional dependence risk, I think is a pretty easily parameterized one. Basically, there's a set of things that are pretty easily amenable to automated testing, right? Where you can work up some test cases and do that. And then I think there's always going to be a place for sort of the edge cases. And a lot of us sort of make careers on thinking about the edge cases, right? So I think like if you believe that that is true, you would first need to do the actual studies, but you're going to have a human somewhere in there to understand sort of what that distribution looks like and where you are and sort of leverage very carefully how much is automated versus not. And I think that is a more appropriate role for red teaming in the longer term, which is to say, yeah, semi-automation would be great. I don't think that we've understood enough about the problem space. I think we've willfully not understood enough of the problem space to understand where it's most appropriate. Yeah.
Thinking about, the interests that you have up and the kind of differences and, clearly types of workers that are doing red teaming in different contexts. Can you talk about differences that you've noticed or seen and how their work is structured, why a company might choose a certain form of red teaming versus another, like offshoring versus not? And
yeah, great question. I don't know yet, right? I think the question of why you would choose one versus the other is a really interesting way to frame it, right? Because it's like, if you were given the choice to have your sort of in-house team focus its, work in sprints along with this product release to do this versus working with a third party, like what would you choose? I'm curious who the you is in that situation, right? Like I think, is there an actual decision maker who has that type of leeway? More often, I think it's like, oh, we've decided that this part of the organization only gets these resources, and that's like a much higher up. So I don't know, I think that's a really great question and a complicated one.
All right. I think time is up, and we're going to give a round of applause to Emily.
Thanks, everyone. And I really want to just give a quick thank you to my co-authors on these papers too. These are their titles and the tops of their PDFs. Rosie, Tiffany, Alana, and my supervisors, Tom and Nikki, and to all of my partners and institutions that support the work. So thanks again.